Hi, folks. Harry Frank from Red Giant here, and this is week 4 of AFX 217. And today we're going to kick off the water ID. Now, what I've got completed as of now is sort of a work in progress. What we're going to be doing is more or less assembling the elements and kind of getting the big picture of what we're going to be doing. So we've got some underwater footage that was actually supplied by FX Guide that was shot down New Zealand area, as far as I know. So we'll use that sort of as a background plate. We'll track that and then add our elements around it. So we'll add the water surface up here, which is done with Tsunami, some light rays with trap code Shine, and then add some water particle effects using trap code Particular. We'll also do a quick sort of drop into the ocean surface, and things left to do is basically cover up this transition here, finalize the particle effects, that kind of stuff. But mainly what we're going to do is sort of get the scene prepped. We'll get it tracked, get the basic water, light, and text elements in there. We'll also get started with Tsunami. We'll go over the basic concepts of water particles, and sort of simulating bubbles under the surface. But from here, we'll need to tweak these and actually get the motion in place, or at least the position and correct behavior to match the scene. So, by next week, we should have more of a complete version of this. And also, feel free to post your versions. This doesn't necessarily have to be the correct version. This is just my version. And keep in mind, when I design these, I focus more on the educational aspect and what I can pass along to you rather than coming up with an awesome design. I could spend 3 weeks coming up with an awesome design, but I tend to focus on what you can take from this and how you can apply it, basically what you can learn from it. So the first thing we're going to do is take a look at the footage that we've got, and this will be supplied to you. This is some underwater footage right here. It's kind of an odd resolution that I've got. If I get a larger version, I'll post this, but I sort of have a preview version, so it's 1024 by 540. But for educational purposes, this is just fine. In fact, we'll be able to work with this just perfectly. So this is we'll call this the start of our water ID, and I always call this 2 because this is the second time I've done this. Now I'm going to use Mocha AE to track this. Now I'm not necessarily going to do a camera track. I'm just going to track the motion, which will give us the position, rotation, and scale of what's going on in here. And then from there, we can use that data to apply it to things like our water surface, our light rays with Shine, our text, even our particles, because we'll actually parent a camera to that motion. Because there's not a whole lot of actual Z motion here, or back and forth motion. There's a little bit, but not a whole lot. So I'm not too concerned about doing a 3D track with this. Now, we could go into Camera Tracker and doing all that, but I think sticking with the tools that you have, which is Mocha AE, should work just fine. So generally, I showed you Mocha Import before, but if you don't have Mocha Import, another way to get this into Mocha AE is simply right-click on it and say Reveal it in your project. I'll highlight it there, and then right-click again and say Reveal in Finder, or in Windows you'll see Reveal in Explorer. And it'll highlight where that item is. And then I can right-click and say Open with Mocha AE. Now, like I said, you'll have this if you own After Effects. A lot of people own it and they don't even know, but it ships with After Effects, and it should even install with After Effects. Now, generally, I just leave everything as is, but because this is such an odd size, it's actually choosing a very weird pixel aspect for me. I'm just going to reset that to 1 and hit OK. I'm going to overwrite a test project that I had here and squeeze everything into my 1024 window here. So here is my footage. We're actually only going to use about the first 10 seconds of it, basically when this big fish comes in right here. So that's sort of my reference, or just after it comes in. So that's going to be my ending point, so I'll just go down here and mark that as my out point. And I can click here to zoom the timeline in, so I'm just focusing on that area. So now all I need to do is track an area that Mocha sort of can hang on to and calculate what my camera is doing. Now, again, we're not camera tracking, we're just tracking motion, but we're analyzing a plane of data. So it's trying to see where this surface is. So I'm going to create a layer here to track with. So I'll go up to my X-spline tool. You can use other splines like B-splines, but I like the X-spline in here. So I'm just going to highlight this area or draw a shape out. This is the area that it's going to track. And I'm going to hide some of these things here, like edge properties, overlay colors, so I can actually see my layer names here. I'm going to label this my track layer. Now, when I track, right here using these buttons, I can track forward and backward. By default, this track, the spline, is actually going to link to that track. So the spline is going to move around with that track. Sometimes you actually might want to unlink it. In this case, I have sort of the same shape, more or less, that is being tracked. So this diagonal shape, and the camera's kind of moving around, and this shape is moving with it. So one option I would have here, if I start to see a little bit of slipping as this shape tries to move around and follow it, is actually just to unlink it and just have it track this raw area unlinked from the track. So basically it will calculate that movement, but just looking at the same area over and over and not moving along with the track. I'm going to try it first with the link turned on. We can also go in, turn in our surface tool just to see exactly what kind of surface movement that we're getting here. So I can squeeze this together. Again, it's not really a surface, it's kind of a bumpy ocean floor, but we're going to call this sort of a ground plane that we're looking at. And as it tracks, we can see how well that sort of matches to what we see the camera doing. So from here, let's go down here. We don't actually have a whole lot of perspective to worry about, so I'm going to leave that unchecked. I'll set the minimum pixels used to 50%. It's basically just how many pixels, the percentage of pixels in this area that it needs to match. So the lower the number, the faster it will go, and perhaps more inaccurate it will be. Higher makes it go slower, and perhaps, possibly, get more accurate. Although that's not always the case. So I'm in the middle of my clip, so I'm going to end up tracking backward and forward. So let's just hit track. And we'll do the magical edit to get us to the finished track. And track forward. Now I'm actually going to stop it here, because this introduces an interesting problem that I forgot to stop and work around, but actually it leads us to a good point here. This footage actually has these little black bars at the bottom and the top. Now, I could have cropped these out, but because this actually brings a good point into the tracking process of working around this. Because this could be anything. This could be a fence or a pole or a post or anything in the way that sort of blocks your tracking process. So what I want to do is work with the layers and work with the layer order. So if I consider this tracking layer, this to be my background, this is the area that's furthest away from the camera. Now, if this were a foreground object that was sort of in the way, we would want this foreground object to be masked out. So what I'm going to do is simply create a spline layer and outline this black box area. One more point down here. Okay. X to pan around and Z to shimmy in. Actually, it looks like I did a very bad job drawing that. Let's try this one more time. 4 points. 1, 2, 3, 4. Shouldn't be too hard. And double click. I'll select all these and just make it a flat-on square like that. So this is an area that I'd like to call a foreground object, or an object that we would like to ignore because it's not a background object. It's not the background. So this is whatever. I'll just call this obscure or whatever. It doesn't really matter. But as long as this is in the foreground, if I go back, as you can see, I was letting this track, and then it was running into this black area, and the track started to squash because it saw an area that wasn't moving, and it kind of started to screw up my track. So now with this here, let's uncheck the cog so it doesn't actually track that layer. That's what that cog means. And we can also lock it so it doesn't, we don't need to do anything else to it. So now let's select our track layer. And instead of getting this squash as it runs into that black area, let's position it right here and then rerun the track. And what you're going to see is that it's basically ignoring that layer and using the motion and pixels from the rest of the image. And giving us a pretty good track. So this foreground layer could be anything. Let's say you have a person that is in the foreground and moving around and you wanted to track the background. The same idea would apply. You would create a mat that follows the person, you put the layer on top, and then you track the background. So the next question is, how do we get this data over to After Effects? Well, this is Mocha AE. It's designed specifically to work with After Effects. So you'll see a very handy button that we have here as soon as this finishes tracking. And there's our big fish coming in. Okay, so we've more or less completed our track here. It's looking pretty good. I'm going to select this track, or make sure that it's selected, and then I'm going to go down here to Export Tracking Data. And I'm going to, it's not use corner pin, but I'm going to use transform data, After Effects transform data. And you notice these are the only options that I have here, which are After Effects options. If you want more options, Mocha Pro supports a slew of other formats in here that will allow you to get data to and from a number of systems, including Autodesk systems, that kind of thing, even I think Quantel. So we'll just work with After Effects. Copy that to the clipboard. We don't even need to export a file. Let's go back over here to our water ID. I'm just going to create a null object, and I'd like to rename this tracking null. So this is going to hold all of our tracking data. Let's rewind to the beginning just by hitting home, and I'm going to paste that that data right onto that null object. Actually, you can see it goes right up to where that fish is. Let's trim this up. So I'll just hit end, mark the end of our range, and trim comp to the work area. Now you notice that it adds both anchor point and position. Now anchor point is useful if you're doing stabilization, or position is useful if you're doing match moving or tracking like we're doing. So I'm actually just going to get rid of the tracking, or the anchor point data, just by clicking on the stopwatch and zero that out. There we go. So we can see we've got a pretty good track. You can see it scaling up a little bit as things get closer, as the camera moves a little bit in Z-space. And that's looking pretty good so far. So now this background footage is a little bit murky. So first thing I want to do in getting things prepped here is just do a little bit of color correction on here. Now, we could use something like Colorista too, but I'm not really focusing on that in this course. I'm going to use Looks. Now, not to say that you're missing out. I think I mentioned this before, in that Looks, oops, which looks like I didn't apply it, Magic, but Looks there. Looks has all of the tools that you will find in Colorista. So if you go over to the Tools Post section, you will find all of the things that you will find in Colorista, including something called Pop. And this is a very specific process to Colorista. It's kind of its own little way of adding contrast around colored edges, or where contrasting edges meet. So it just kind of adds an overall pop to it, which is good because this is kind of a murky scene. I'm also going to punch it up just a little bit with some curves. Let's drive curves down here and drag contrast, add a bit of an S-curve. Over here, as you can see in the RGB parade, just sort of an interesting note, if you ever do want to make something look underwater, or you're trying to match color to underwater footage, this is sort of the characteristic underwater color scheme where you're your reds are actually almost non-existent. They're pretty flat compared to the rest of the colors. So or green and blue are full of colored data, and then red is just gone. I'm sure there's some science and math behind that, but I don't know. All I know is that red just kind of goes away underwater. So that's the simple color correction that I'm going to do right now. Yeah, let's pop back over here. So we're going to create this water surface with a plugin called Red Giant Tsunami. Let me create a comp here. I'm actually going to make this a little bit bigger than the size that I'm working with the footage. So that was 10 something, 1050 something or whatever. So I want to make this a little bit bigger because ultimately what I'm going to do, because we don't have a tremendous amount of camera movement in Z-space, is to sort of match this in two-dimensionally and match the XY position and the scale and rotation to get that water surface up on the top. And this will work just fine. So let me create my comp, create a solid for Tsunami. And let's go under Red Giant Tsunami. Now, I'll speak honestly here. Part of my job is to represent Red Giant and talk about our plugins and help people understand these plugins. But a certain amount of what I do requires a certain amount of credibility. In other words, I can't talk to people and teach them about things if I don't sound credible. So that said, if I speak about Tsunami and just talk about it and sing its praises, I don't think I would be too believable because there are some obvious shortcomings. So I'm not going to dodge around them. I'm going to speak to them firsthand. And I'm not a project manager or a product manager for Red Giant. I simply demonstrate the plugins and help people understand them. If you find these shortcomings frustrating, then it's time to use your voice and speak out to Red Giant and let them know that you'd like to see this plugin updated. Because, well, at first glance, it does look a little dated. The interface right here where we load presets looks about from the time of operating system 8 on the Mac. So the major shortcomings, I'll just tackle the two that I think really stand out with Tsunami. First, Tsunami dates back to a time when cameras really didn't exist in After Effects. Believe it or not, there was a time when everything was 2D and there were no cameras, and there certainly was no way for After Effects to connect a plugin to the 3D world of After Effects because there really wasn't one. So sometimes plugins just integrated their own internal 3D camera, and that's exactly what Tsunami has. So that's great. So I can move a camera in X and Y and move it up and down, but this is all internal within the plugin. Now there are ways to connect cameras with expressions and all that, but it gets a little tricky because Tsunami actually measures distance in something logical, which is meters, unlike After Effects, which uses pixels, and it doesn't always just line up. But fortunately, we don't need a whole lot of Z and X and Y. Really, we can render sort of a flat image and track that in. And that's kind of how I think of Tsunami, as really it is a stock footage generator rather than a 3D environment that I work within. That said, you could do it if you want to have a massive water environment that does move. I would say just to use the camera here and try to match things in various ways with expressions and all that. But we're not going to do that here. I don't really, like I said, I think of Tsunami as a stock footage generator. So that said, problem number 2 is speed. This also dates back to a time when there was no OpenGL rendering or ways to hand off rendering to the graphics card in your machine, which exists solely to process graphic tasks. So this is all CPU based, and it does render a little bit slowly. Now, it doesn't look too bad right here as I'm scrubbing around. I mean, it does downsample to, looks like about half or maybe even quarter resolution. But what really starts to take a long time to render is when we switch the render mode, which defaults to texture. So basically, we're seeing a flat surface here without any surface displacement. We go into realistic. This is actually going to render 3D geometry, and that's where you start to see these sort of bumps in the surface. So that said, why would you want to use Toonami? Well, in terms of water or ocean simulation software for After Effects, it is the only water simulation software for After Effects. Now, there are other 3D displacement plugins that you can use, certainly. You'd have to manually rig them together with all your fractal noise maps and wave maps and all that. Everything is built into Toonami. So the ocean waves naturally occur due to wind. So we're going to go into our primary waves section here and crank up the wind speed. And this is going to add some much more pronounced waves. We can also add a little more detail in here by decreasing the fine grid size. So we see some more of that detail going on. Now, if you want to speed things up as we're adjusting the size of the waves and all that, you can simply have this jump to wireframe, and this might be a little quicker. Now the waves are moving away from us. Let's go in, let's change the wind direction just a little bit. So it's going left to right. That seems pretty decent. Now it does look a bit like sunset, and our footage doesn't necessarily look like it's towards the end of the day. So let's go back to let's just go to texture here. Let's go to light, which controls the sunlight here. Light number 1. The elevation, oops. Notice as it goes down into the sunset, the light reaction of the atmosphere actually kind of behaves like a real atmospheric color. So all of the appropriate light wavelengths and all that fancy stuff that happens when light moves through a thicker part of the atmosphere. That's basically what's happening, is that you have light passing through a thicker and thicker and thicker atmosphere as it moves down towards the horizon, because there's more atmosphere between you and the sun where we're seeing. So if I move this up, basically it'll look a lot less like sunset and more like middle of the day. And maybe I want to move it over to the side just a little bit. So that's the azimuth. Basically, we're moving the light, the position of the light, the angle of the light in its position in the sky. Now, if you want the sun a little bit lower, but you don't want it visible, that would be the viewed size of the sun. So we can squeeze it down or make it bigger, or just get rid of it altogether. But I'll actually just push this back, oops, the other way. Move this back up. Let's go back into the primary waves. Let's crank up this wind speed. Oh, wait. I was thinking we're not seeing a whole lot of waves, because actually we're only viewing texture. You know, and maybe this will work. I don't know. I'll keep it like this for now, and then what we'll do is actually dunk below the surface. Let's go back to our camera controls here. And so this elevation here right now, we're 10 meters above the water. If I put this at 0, we'd basically be like right at the water's surface. There we go. And if I set this to a negative value, we go below the water surface. And with the settings that I've got here, it's actually, there's a lot of changes that I would have to do to get this to work. But there's a preset that I kind of like that works well above the surface, or below the surface versus above the surface. So I'm actually going to use 2 different settings here, and I'll just match the cameras between the 2. So the big idea is that we're going to just have maybe a less than a second above the water, and we're going to drop below. So this is the setting I want above the water. So I'm going to label this Toonami above. And let's duplicate that. Below. I want it all caps. There we go. Let's turn this one off, go up here. So let's load another preset. I'll load actually, I don't think that was just the default settings we were working with. So these are all the presets here. I'm going to pull up one called Underwater Dark Water and hit go. There we go. So that's the one below the water. Let's go to camera and let's flatten it out just a little bit. In fact, let's go to the render options, set this just to texture. There we go. So I'm just adjusting the angle of the camera as well as the elevation. So now it's a little bit below the water. So I'm going to connect the elevation of this camera to the other tsunami layer. So let's go into first layer, option click that elevation, option or alt click depending on your platform. And we've made a little expression for the elevation. So now I can just connect it to the elevation of this one. So as I move the elevation of the below layer, the above layer will move with it. So I'll have to do a little bit of a crossfade. That's just fine. So start this at 0. This is, like I said, this is going to be a very quick transition. So we should see the above water settings right now. Oh wait, I don't because I am below the surface. So let's go to this one right here. And so we want to set a keyframe for that because that's where we wanted it to be. And then let's set this to where it was before, 10. So this camera is going to go from 10 down below the surface and then do a quick crossfade between the two. So it takes some finagling, as we say. There we go. So basically it looks like we're sort of, from a point of view, our first-person perspective, we're snorkeling or what? Oh, that's 10 frames. I was thinking this was 1 second. That's the 1 second mark. So let's stretch this out a little bit. So I'm just holding down Alt or Option to stretch these keyframes out. Might be thinking what the heck I was doing. I thought that was 1 second mark, so I was doing the whole thing inside 10 frames, which wasn't very impressive. So right there is where it drops below the surface, so that's where I want my crossfade to sort of happen. This might actually go a little too far down. Let's use a little lower of a value, so we're a little closer to the surface, so it doesn't have to move as quickly. So I'll make that crossover point happen a little bit later, so let's see where that happens. Now, as this goes subsurface, as it goes below the surface, we're going to add some bubbles and stuff, splashing bubbles, to add to this transition. Looks like we're pretty good. And actually, I'm going to try getting away with without using any actual geometry being rendered. Or I suppose, worst case is I could just use it on the above version, which is another good reason to split our rendering here. So I can set this to realistic, and we get all those swells and stuff in there. Let's go into our primary waves and lower that just a little bit. That seems a little rough seas for snorkeling, but that's a tough phrase to say. Rough seas for snorkeling. Yeah, you can see, wow, that actually does take a little bit longer. So we'll just remember that. Maybe we'll come back to that. I'm going to leave this at just no geometry texture. So this, as I mentioned, is a little bit bigger than our scene. So this is something we're just going to drop in and track. So this is our tsunami comp. Let's go into our water ID, grab that tsunami comp, throw it in here, and parent it. So let's pull up our parenting column, parent this to the tracking null, and hide that parenting column. So we're going to have some finagling to do here. That's twice I've used that word, finagling. I never use it. I don't know why. I'm using finagle today. But we'll need some tweaking, basically. Let's move these back up. So we've got our initial water here. And now this is angled because we've parented this. So actually, let me unparent this first. Let's do this. Let's parent it at the very first frame. So let's go here, reset our transforms so that this thing is flat onto the screen. And at this point, this is where we will parent it. So now our pre-comp plays out. So we go from above the surface to below the surface. And then that's where our ocean track kicks in. So now we obviously have to be able to see through this. So I'm going to go in here and just set this to screen. Oh, that back one. Oh, actually, you know what? Off camera, I did a little test here of moving that underwater footage in with it, which, well, I guess that's not extremely complicated. So right now I've got my ocean comp below the comp window, and just I'm having it kind of move in and mimic that move. Again, it's all very rough because we're going to try to sort of cover these things up in post. It's coming way late. Let's move this and right about there. Too late. We'll keep track. I'll keep nudging these things around. But really, I'm trying to get all my elements prepped here. Got my water surface. And my underwater footage. Okay, pretty close. We'll call that roughed in. Let's actually trim up this comp too. My start timecode is actually the shooting timecode, so let's set that back to 0. And we've been making these all about 6 seconds, so let's keep this one at 6 seconds for now. We've got our above and then our below shot. Okay, so we've got our, we scale the tsunami footage up. That's why we made it a little bit big, and I can move it upward like that. And actually, I'm seeing this angle here for the below shot. Angle's still a little bit too flat, or I'm sorry, not flat enough. So I'm going to move this tilt so we're not looking up at the water too much. Flatten it out. Let's keep it right at 90. In this subsurface shot, the below shot, I'm going to move the light elevation so that it's actually a little closer to the surface, and it's going to add some more detail in our surface down here. And in the primary waves here, let's check our fine grid. Yeah, that's actually 0.2, and the grid size, the coarse grid size, I'll bring up as well, just to add some more detail. Now let's take a look. Okay, so we'll definitely have to smooth that transition. We'll have to add some bubbles and all that kind of stuff. But let's just get our title in that we're going to be using. So that's that same type. This one right here. Type. So that's just our 2D layer. So in fact, I don't even need to make it 3D. I'm just going to parent it to the tracking null, scale it down a little bit, position it where it needs to go. We'll probably have this transition on with the bubbles. In fact, let's turn off the tsunami layer so things render a lot quicker. Okay, so we've got that tracked with the scene. One more thing I'm going to do is add some volumetric light along with our tsunami. So I'm going to use shine for this. So let's go up to new solid, create just a solid that's an adjustment layer. We'll put Trapcode shine, and we want, oops, I put particular. Why did I put particular? I want Trapcode shine. Let's go to a blending mode of perhaps overlay or add. I'm not sure. Let's try overlay for now. In colorize, let's set this to none, so it's going to absorb the original colors from the image that it's seen. And the source point will actually copy that tracking data, but I'm just going to put it kind of over here somewhere. And let's put a little boost light and some shimmer. So let's go up here to shimmer and turn these up. So we want that sort of visible light over on that one side in our below layer. So I actually need to go into our light and move that azimuth over. Remember, the azimuth is the light position, or basically the sunlight position. Right there. So now the light is there. We should see it if I move it down right there. There we go, and we'll kind of match the shine position to that. So really all I'm going to do is go to the tracking null and copy this position data and paste it to the source point of the shine. Now, we could use expressions and all that, but there's a reason I'm doing that is because I don't want it locked to the null point. I want to offset it and move it over there. So all I have to do is simply click on that source point parameter name, and it will select all of the keyframes. So now if I move all of these, or as I change the value, it's going to change it for all of these keyframes over here. So now I should have the shine point locked to the tracking null that we got from Mocha, and things are starting to look pretty good. This week, actually, what I'd like to do is stop saying that we're going to somehow fix this transition and actually fix this transition, because it's pretty rough at this point. And although I've done this a few times as I do it on the fly, things are kind of subtly different, every time you try to do them. So let's try to figure this out, and I'm gonna try to figure this out on the fly. So I like this surface that we've got here. As it goes below, right here is where it ends. So that's where I stop needing it. So I'm just going to trim that out, and we'll figure out something to take over at that point, or at least fade in above it. So let's turn on our layer that starts below, and that looks great below. So it's this transition point right here that we don't really have a whole lot covering things up. In fact, this thing turns on right about at the right point. So this layer actually can go above the surface. So I'm just going to fudge it and put this exactly where I want this to be at the transition point, which is just above the surface. In fact, I could set this maybe at 0.1 or so, 0.1. Yeah, 0.2. I don't want that visible sun there. In fact, I probably don't want Oh, yeah, you know what I did? Because I had this one using an expression to follow this first one, it's now not sitting above the surface. So, rather than using all that fancy expressions trickery, let's try a different way of doing this, which is just say, okay, I want this to start at 10. That's where I want it. And then it's going to go down to the surface, which is a 0. In fact, it's going to hit the surface. Oh, yeah, right about there. So that goes down. And then that goes below the surface. So let's take a look at this layer here. I don't want to see the sun, so we'll go to light 1, viewed size, set that to 0 so we don't actually see it. Try to get close to the surface right there. Okay, now what I want to do probably is on the below shot is start the camera so that it's actually matching this one a little bit better so that I can animate the camera into place. So right here, I'm happy with those camera settings, so I'll just set keyframes for all of these. In fact, I don't think we've even touched roll. Roll goes like this. Kind of rolls on its z-axis, I guess. And let's look at tsunami above. Actually, what I'll do is just set keyframes for all of these. Hit U to show all those keyframes. Cut those keyframes, just Control X or Command X, and go to our top layer and move back to that first keyframe by hitting J. J and K go back and forth. And let's paste those. So now I just pasted the settings from the above camera to the below camera. So at this point, they should, match up in terms of their horizon line and all that. So this is where it goes below. So now as this comes in, right where it hits this point is where it kind of looks like it's right at the surface level of the water. Now let's see what we're losing by not using realistic settings here. Are we going to get a nice sort of watery? Yeah. I know, I'm going to try to do it without geometry. So I think this is a pretty good place to leave this. We've got the water surface and the tracking all done. So what we need to do is cover up this transition point and smooth things out. So we'll mainly do that with bubbles and a little bit of a camera shake. And in doing that, we'll cover a lot of detail in terms of Trapcode Particular and a lot of the options that you've got within Trapcode Particular to do physical simulations underwater. So we'll see you next week. Thanks so much for watching, and until then, we'll see you on the forums.